Good morning or afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you very much for taking time from your day and joining us today. My name's Alex Rolfe. I'm the Managing Director of Payments, Cards and Mobile. And again, just want to say thanks very much for joining what we feel is a very important webinar. I think that we can all be in agreement that fraud is a rising problem, not just in the European market, but globally as well. And as the payments market moves ahead, the fraud is always seeming to be either at its side or one step ahead. As such, PCM teamed up with NETS again after our successful fraud report of 2019, where we gave some insights with Suna last year. The purpose of this webinar is to give an update from the cutting edge of fraud detection and what's going on with fraudsters in the market. And we're very much looking forward to your inputs later on. A little bit of housekeeping first up. Any technical issues you should see, you have an ability to ask questions, and our partner Workcast will get onto those problems as soon as they can. Just bear with us. There is a live Q&A with Suna at the end, and please feel free to ask your questions as you go along. If you do see something specific to a slide, please just reference the number of the slide in your question, which allows us to be able to answer that as quickly as possible when we get to the Q&A and be able to draw up that slide if there's something to talk about on it. Finally, the webinar will be made available. So this is a recorded program, and if you want to share it with your colleagues or listen to it again, we'll be making sure that you get it at the end of the program. Finally, enough from me. I want to introduce Sune Gabelgård. Sune is Head of Digital Fraud Intelligence and Research at NETS. He's got a long and interesting career outside of payments as well. Sune, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and I hope that everybody can hear me. So sorry about the picture. That's me, the egghead. I joined NETS almost a year ago, heading up a new unit in Edge, where we're going to try to move to be a little bit more proactive in the way that we combat fraud. And I'll get back to what I mean by being proactive instead of being reactive a little bit later in the presentation. Before joining the financial sector, I have been working for police and national security intelligence service for 17 years. And then I joined a little bit more than 5 years ago the financial sector in Danske Bank. I was a part of establishing the global fraud unit. Both in my work in the police and intelligence service and also in the bank, I met a lot of academic people and found that very interesting. So I also decided that I wanted to join that world of the academics. So I have been doing a master's in counter fraud, counter corruption of the University of Portsmouth. And with that, I think that I have a kind of a broad portfolio of background. I actually started out as a carpenter a lot of years ago. So, and that's very much describing me. I'm a kind of learning by doing type of guy and not afraid to get my hands dirty still today. So the 17 years in the police, I invested a lot of trying to get inside the mind of the criminals to understand how they were thinking. And what I realized when I joined the financial sector was that it was equally interesting to understand what is going on inside the head of some of the victims. And that's actually what I focused on with my master's, where I have been writing my master's thesis about the victims of investment fraud, trying to get an understanding on why it is that you suddenly become attracted to investing a lot of money based on a kind of an ad you see on social media, Facebook or similar. Quite honest, and frankly, I could say that the first time I saw a case like that, I was really puzzled with how you could end up investing, millions into something that you just saw online. I found the answers now, so I have a little bit more nuanced picture of the victims. Happy to share that, but that will be a presentation in itself. And if you're interested in that, just reach out. So let's jump away from me into the interesting stuff. So when I joined the financial sector and were leaving the police, I had a need to understand what it is that I was going to do. And being a kind of a visual guy, I painted this kind of coordinate system to understand who my enemy was at that time. So on the left side, you can see that how much money can I gain out of cyber fraud, and at the bottom, the number of victims that you can reach depending on what you're doing. And at the time when I left the police, this was the picture I had. I was pretty naive, I will admit that. So the fortune hunters, which is the type of people I would describe as happy-go-lucky people that will send you an email, say that you have an uncle in somewhere in a distant part of the world that has left you $55 million just waiting for you. And then the organized criminals that were at the time when I left the police and were entering the financial sector were having a lot of fun with doing card fraud, and some of it was already at that point pretty advanced, I would say. They were earning a lot of money on that, and you could say that the good thing about fraud is normally that you don't have to pay taxes of what you do or what you earn on fraud. And at the same time, back in 13 and 14, these criminals could also see that some banks and financial institutions were actually trying to take up the battle and try to push back and prevent some of the fraud. So they could see a little bit of a decrease in their earnings. At the same time, they noticed the group of people on the right, the hacker guys that can reach a lot of people. Not always that sophisticated when it comes to turning what they do into money, and not all of them are evil people at all. And this is actually pretty interesting. I think that the first time I saw a kind of hacker type of guy getting access to money that he could move around, he moved it to his own account, and I would not recommend to do that. That will eventually get you caught. And something like data. In the beginning, these guys, they didn't have any clue of what the value of data was. But the organized criminals, they saw some business opportunities here, so they actually reached out to the hacker guys. And then a kind of a phenomenon arose, which we call fraud as a service. And it sounds wrong because this sounds good, but it's not. It's a kind of a scene where you can get... you can move from being the fortune hunter, not very advanced, into using some technologies that have been built by the hacker types, and then you'll be able to do very advanced IT attacks and fraud types as well. One of the examples I will come back to later, we have seen some in the card fraud area also with kind of robotic module that were able to mimic human behavior on card transaction level, so to speak, to try to avoid the detection setup at the time. One thing about the fortune hunters, a lot of people normally tend to laugh and also point fingers to Nigeria and also the stupid people that get victimized based on a mail like the one I described, with your uncle leaving you a lot of money. And one thing that we just need to be very clear about is that as long as we see those mails in either our spam filter or in our inbox, somebody somewhere around the world are becoming victims, because otherwise these guys, they would move to something else to get their money. And also talking about Nigeria, I actually would avoid pointing fingers at people there, because we actually learned those people how to do this kind of fraud. That's again another whole nother webinar we could do about that. Also a very interesting topic. One of the other interesting things about this one here is that that people with normal moral and ethics, I tend to say like us and our kids, they would normally in the physical world never move into the area of doing anything illegal. Some get stressed just by thinking of they have to look into the eye of a victim, and in the digital world that is a little bit easier. You don't have to look at the people you defraud, and sometimes you can have a tendency to think that there is no victim. It's just the banks paying, so there's nobody losing anything here. And that kind of way of thinking could actually potentially, if we don't get this one right, move normal people to become criminals, because they see their friends doing some kind of fraud as a service, getting a lot of money out of it, and not a lot of people get prosecuted for what they do. So not only do they perceive it as victims, as it's also kind of without any threat of getting prosecuted if you do this. So I think we need to solve this also on behalf of our society to make it a better place. And moving on, one of the learnings from the financial sector is also that so far the focus on stopping financial crime have been very much on the monitoring part, and of course a lot of stuff have been done in other areas than the detection part, but there's not always a link to the detection phase. And I think that that a normal question I have met in the past is that when you have a fraud case, so why didn't our fraud monitoring stop this transaction? Why did we miss it? And that's completely fair question to ask, but sometimes the answer to why we didn't stop the fraud is not in the detection phase. That is in one of the other lanes that you can see here. And moving on to the next slide, I'll try to deep dive a little bit into what I mean with that. So this one is very much inspired by the NIST framework. And the NIST framework is from the US, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They made a kind of a framework for cybersecurity, describing what it is you need to think about to get a good kind of cybersecurity. And the good thing about that NIST framework is that everybody should get familiar with it, because you can use it in almost anything you do. Because what it is about is just to try to go through your process or your product, and then try to look for vulnerabilities in what you have been building. And this one is absolutely not to make a new kind of compliance or risk regime. This is just to be aware of the risk that you have when you introduce a new product or a new process. So this should absolutely not be seen as a kind of a showstopper. But this should be more like a kind of an end-to-end analysis of what we're doing, and trying to identify the gaps and see the opportunities to stop fraud. Then you can go live with a MVP, so you don't have to have protection in any layer, but then you would know if something happens, what to do and how to handle that. So one of the things that we could do in the card world was to, for example, ask ourselves, why is it that we keep on issuing cards with printed card numbers and CVVs on? That could potentially, at least in the good old world, lead to fraud if criminals obtain that. It could also be a question of why do we keep on issuing cards with static card data? Why don't we move ahead? And especially being in the part of the northern part of Europe with a lot of digitized people, it would be a nice next step to move into virtual cards, where you can have that dynamic data, so you're actually not able to use it if it's compromised. One thing is, if we move away from the first lane with identifying into the phase where you could say have let the customer inside your bank or your company, and then they need to start using some of the products or the services that you offer. Then you should also ask yourself questions here. So do we need to have some profiles for people? Do we need to let everybody have the same ATM limit? That's the example I have here. So let's say that I, as a person, I never withdraw more than 1,000 kroner. So why do I have a limit of 15,000 on a daily basis? I don't need that. And by doing so, you're also introducing what you could call digital hygiene. So with giving me the limit of 1,000 instead of 15,000, and then maybe just make a solution where I can easily get my limit of 15,000 if that is what the banks want to offer for me. But maybe I should do a kind of step up to get that limit. Then you would be able to prevent some fraud even before the transaction occurs. So, and that is the way of thinking that we need to have to avoid the kind of the fraud we see today, and also the volumes we see today. And one of the things that have been kind of challenged in the phase where we then try to detect. So that's the third, the middle lane. Is what we have been doing is basically chasing known modus operandi. So you could say that's kind of the good old way of stopping fraud, is to analyze the fraud we know and then try to create a rule or model that could stop it in future. But I think that with the creative criminals we are facing and the digital world rolling, we need to get ahead and try to detect anomalies. So here we need to go into something that without it should have any negative sound is profiling. So making a kind of a standard for how Sune behaves with his debit card, how Sune behaves with his credit card, and then being able to detect anomalies that doesn't look like fraud, but where I just kind of step out of my normal behavior as a customer. And then another thing, especially in the card world, is to think about could we have a feedback loop that were a little bit faster than we have today. Today we have to wait for customers to realize that money was withdrawn from their account, and then they need to make a dispute, and at least back in the days that was a very manual phase. It could take several weeks or months before we got that feedback loop. And that is something that we need to think about as well, because when we move into detecting anomalies, it's not because we have to leave behind the detection of the known fraud. We should still continue to do that because that is still successful. And the last part is where we should ask the why. So we should challenge the as-is situation. And that is also not accepting the answer that this is the way we've been doing for 40 years. That's not an answer to why. And also in this phase and also in the response phase, we should think about not only how we can avoid fraud, but also how we can reduce the pain of the customer. So could we get away some of the ease of having a card blocked and having fraud on a card by, for example, introducing a virtual card that we could do an instant issuing of and provide that for customers. So that's also the good thing about working with this way of detecting and preventing fraud, is that maybe you could also use this to be inspired on how you could create a better customer journey than we have today. I think there's a need for that, because at least in the card world, a lot of people experience card fraud or card fraud attempts, and I think that there is actually a window of opportunity here to turn that into a, maybe not a great customer experience, but at least based on the outcome, the fraud case, you could turn it into something positive if you're able to get your customer through the phase of having this experience. I think that we should see it as a window of opportunities instead of just giving up and leaning back and saying, this is just a pain for the customer and we'll never get out of that. Yes, and I will move on to the next slide. So this is to give an example also of a little bit of the NIST framework and the way that we think about the detection phase of protecting cards. So what we have been doing in the past is the orange layer 1 and then layer 3 with prevention and layer 4 with monitoring. So since 13 we have been using neural networks, and also just to drop a few buzzwords here, AI is one of the topics that everybody talk about, and not a lot of people succeed with this. And what is AI? Well, that's a very broad definition of a lot of stuff. One of the elements in AI is neural network, and that is actually something that we have introduced with quite great success way back in 13, way before I joined the financial sector, and maybe that's why they had success with it. I'm not sure. But the new one, I'll just take layer 3 as well. So prevention rules is the rules that actually reject transaction to prevent the fraud. The monitoring rules is where the threshold is not completely achieved, but we still think it's a little bit suspicious, and then we need to have somebody to look at it and analyze whether it could be fraud or not. And then layer 2 is NIST fraud ensemble. That is a little bit new for us here in NIST. We introduced it in the summer of 19, and NIST fraud ensemble is actually what it's called. So it is an ensemble of models. So it's the model of models, you could say. So a lot of different models playing together. And what it actually does is a little bit of what I described, where we need to go in the detection phase to look at the profiling of the entities. So this is not only the card and the card holder, it's also all other elements in a transaction string, where you need to go in and give it a very granular profiling. And instead of having a good old rule where you say if it's after midnight and it's cross-border and above 500 euros, then reject, then we actually ask a lot of questions and get a lot of answers, and then in the end we'll take a decision on all these informations that we receive. I have a next slide where I'll just deep dive a little bit into what I'm actually saying or trying to say. One of the things that is very interesting is the result of our fraud ensemble, which is I would say that I'm trying to be very realistic about projects where there's buzzwords like machine learning, neural networks, and AI. But this one, I've been really struggling with being negative and trying to hold on to being that old grumpy guy that I'm normally, because this one have turned out to be quite a success. And one of the things that I think has made the achievements being so very positive is the scope of the project was actually changed during the project, because we saw some opportunities to have a better result than the one we had with the first scope. So instead of just holding on to that scope and saying this is what we promised management, then we actually changed the scope and created a great result on that. And from day one going into production, we had a reduction of fraud where we started detecting 25% of the fraud that we didn't stop before. And then that one, of course, have been going up and down a little bit. And at the moment, we are around 40% of the fraud that we didn't stop before. That is now stopped by the fraud ensemble. And that is without creating, or you could say without ruining the false positive ratio. So that was also one of the success criteria for this project. And and I think that the interesting thing also going live with this one is that when we then look at, you could say, the threat out there, the number of attacks and successful fraud cases we saw, the month where we actually got it into full-blown production, that is the month where we have seen the highest number of attacks. So you could say that was just on time that we got this one introduced. But actually, what we were able to achieve with the model was actually that, despite the numbers increasing, what I would call dramatically in September, October, we were able to still reduce the fraud numbers in those months. And I would say that when we get back to normal, I have really high expectations for that one. And yes, I think that I will move on now to the next slide. And this is just to kind of illustrate, again, I'm a visual kind of guy, so I need this one to understand myself what is going on. This is trying to illustrate what a rule is. So if it's above this amount, and if it's after midnight and it is a cross-border and a high-risk merchant, then say no and reject that transaction. One of the challenges with that is that then you kind of need to know what it is you're looking for. So you need to know how fraud looks. And in most cases, you will have a lot of false positives, or at least equally as many false positives as you detect. And that's why we need to get some help from new technologies. But I would also just warn that new technologies, in my opinion, will not do the job itself. And that's why we moved into using a lot of models. And I hope that it will start moving now. Let's see what happens. Yeah, so instead of asking one question and then trying maybe to get into 2-3 layers of answers to a question, we go into several layers in a question tree or decision tree, where we ask a lot of questions, several hundreds of questions to a transaction and to the card holder, the merchant, to get some knowledge about if this is normal or not. And then in the end, we decide what to do with all these information, how to use it. So we haven't actually decided when we start asking questions on which kind of elements it is that we want to use to take the decision in the end. And again, to get a picture of what is going on here, normally I describe this as the rules is like an old blues band with like 3 instruments playing. And that's very cool, and I love blues. But sometimes I also like to hear a large orchestra playing, and that is actually how I see the use of AI. That is like an orchestra where a lot of instruments play together, and then you have somebody deciding which instrument is playing solo at the moment, and who's playing loud and who is not playing loud. And that is a little bit what we do here. And that is also a little bit of what we have been doing in the past. The approach is a little bit different. With the neural network, we have been trying to look for the known fraud patterns, and with the new one here, we're moving to the more kind of profiling way of doing it. And then I think I want to jump into some of the trends that we have seen in the past, and also partially a little bit of predicting what we're going to see. I think a lot of financial institutions have a belief in that the strong customer authentication that will be introduced or further introduced in 21 would reduce fraud, and I'm completely sure that it will, at least on cards. But I'm not believing that it's going to be the end of fraud, and not the end of fraud on cards. I think that the SCA initiative might just push it a little bit around. So I think that we need still to be very clever here to avoid fraud also on cards, and also avoid not to push fraudsters somewhere else where they would have even more success than they did with card. I have experienced that once in my life, where we actually thought that we were stopping fraud, but what we did was actually just to kind of help the fraudsters to move into a very more lucrative area where they had a lot of fun, because we weren't prepared for that, and we should avoid to do that. Absolutely not pushing around the problem. Yes, and one of the things that we have seen in the past is the good old 4-party model that doesn't really exist anymore, because it's more like a street party today. So of course you still have the 4-party model on the transaction string, where you can see that here you have a card with a card holder, and then you have a merchant, you have an acquirer, and then you have, of course, the issuer of the card. So you would be able to, in the good old world, to detect if, for example, a merchant had data compromised. Then you will see a sign of where the data was leaked. But the things happening in e-commerce is that a lot of third-party service providers is entering the world, and I don't think that you would have a e-commerce shop with respect for itself without a chat function or kind of a tracking tool that could give us information about how the customer navigates around in our e-commerce, to understand why they didn't check out at the end, or maybe trying to uncover the opportunities to do a little bit more of selling during the process. So a lot of third-party vendors have entered the web pages of e-commerce. And then with the PCI, at least as it was and maybe still is, a lot of e-commerce merchants, they have an understanding of what they are doing, as they are not handling the card data. So what they do on their web page is not that important, because the worst thing that could happen is that the shop is kind of taken over and shut down, but nothing bad could happen with the data. But that's actually what is happening in this world at the moment with this street party, because when you gain access to an e-commerce webshop, you can do a lot of bad stuff with malicious scripts and so on. It is impossible to avoid this third-party talk, because this is something that is causing a lot of problems in at least in the card world at the moment, and I would also say with identities being leaked all around the world. One of the things that we have seen where this model, and also just before I move on, PSD2 is coming with a lot of new methods to kind of do a payment. And I think that we should also expect that as a kind of an element in this street party, where we again would have to detect new or identify new ways of detecting data breaches around the world in a kind of new ecosystem. And moving on to a phenomenon called Mage card digital or online skimming. It has a lot of different names. I would say that this is a really great is a wrong word, but it's a really good example of fraud as a service, as I described it earlier, because Mage card is not a single group of people. It's basically groups and individuals utilizing fraud as a service and buying in on a method and sometimes also tools that they can use to penetrate the e-commerce web shops, and there is a lot of that going on at the moment. And what happens in this world is that you have a e-commerce web shop that is penetrated and infected with a malicious script. This could be done via several different ways. That could be via vulnerabilities in the web page. It could be by credential stuffing, where you try just to put in usernames and passwords. Could be brute force attacks, where you just try to guess passwords and so on. There's a lot of ways to get inside an e-commerce. And if you have a web shop and you have a CMS system with a username called admin and a password called admin, then it is just a matter of time before you will have a visit from one of these groups, and then they will get you and get this malicious script running. And this is then a lot of different groups and individuals that breaches these merchants, and then they set up servers where they harvest data from these e-commerce. So then they aim at getting stolen card details. They also, in a lot of cases, collect a lot of other data like usernames and passwords, email addresses, and so on, whatever they can get their hand on. And then in most cases, they take this stolen card data and then they tumble it. And then you could say they are mixing the stolen card data. One of the cases we've seen, a group had access to a lot of different web shops where they were harvesting data, and then they were mixing this data, meaning that when a criminal go to these underground markets on dark web, or basically they could also just go to the Facebook group and get information about how to get the card data, then they would buy a bulk of cards. So if I was a criminal and I wanted to do fraud here in Denmark, where I'm situated, I would go in and buy some nice Danish cards, and I would be able to select a specific bank if I wanted that on dark web, and then buy their best quality credit cards. There would be a price attached on that. And the thing is that here we face a challenge not in the very large breaches, but in some of the smaller breaches where maybe only one or two cards is breached because it's very small e-commerce. In these cases, you will never be able to detect the point of compromise, at least not until it is too late. So you will not see where these cards are originating from before it is too late and all cards have abused. We've developed a new method where we're actually capable of doing so and in real time to avoid these smaller breaches, because the larger breaches we still see in our analysis. So that is not really that challenging, I would say. it is more the smaller breaches. One of the examples here is the British Airways and the Ticketmaster breach that is originating from Mage card as a phenomenon. The underground buyers, they then go and use these cards, and some of them, they just buy the goods and get it delivered to some kind of post box where they live. But some of them, they actually go out and hire people, and then they hire people either to be reshippers of goods, or they send people. We have one example here where a group of criminals, they sent 2 persons to Denmark to live in a nice summer house that they rented on a stolen card, and then they were just having that job that they should just wait in that summer house and receive goods for a week, and then put it in their van and then drive it home. So there's different ways of doing that. And then, like in the good old days when you could buy stuff on the street that was stolen, that is also happening today. So when you want that new iPhone and you don't want to pay the full price, and you go to Facebook markets or anywhere else online and find that iPhone that is a little bit cheaper, even though it's totally new, then you need to ask yourself a question: where does that iPhone actually originate from? Because that could be you in the end here helping these criminals to cash out. So just be a little bit critical, I would say, and everybody in the society should be that. Again, back to the thing about if it's too good to be true, or if it sounds too good to be true, then it might be too good to be true. Then there's a lot of actors out in this world that offers dark web intelligence. That's really cool. There's a lot of good stuff out there. There's also a lot of invalid data that you need to filter away. One of the things with Mage card is that some of these groups, they are also kind of closed loops. So meaning that they would be able to penetrate the e-commerce themselves, collect the data, and then also use the data and cash out in the end. So that data will never be seen anywhere for sale around the world. That is also an additional challenge to combating this. Yes, and then moving on, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, have we seen fraudsters trying to kind of avoid the new strong customer authentication? Have we seen anybody trying to test whether that they could kind of trick or game the SCA? And I think that maybe we have seen a couple of examples, and one of them is where you have a criminal that sets up a web shop somewhere on an online market with some nice goods. This is some of the consumer goods that everybody needs. That could be coffee capsules, that could be shaving equipment, whatever everybody needs in their daily life, but also a product where people want to save money. And then he puts up this great shop on this online marketplace, and then he just waits for somebody to see that he got some pretty nice goods, and they are for sale for it's a good offer. So here you have you could say a genuine or a good customer that just want to save some money. They now found this criminal guy's online shop on this online marketplace, and then the person go and buys the goods. And then what happens after that is that when they buy these goods, then the criminals, they have an order in the online shop, and then they go to the original store and buy the goods directly from the original store and have it sent directly to the customer. And this we have seen before, also before we started discussing the SCA. So not a lot of new stuff in here. This is just a great way of trying to avoid any traces that is leading to you. And I'll get back to why I think this one is one where we will see them try to game this one with SCA. And when the goods are then shipped, it's shipped directly to the genuine customer that will be very happy because they have their goods, and in some of the cases they actually have more than they expected to get. So, for example, instead of having the 100 capsules or the one shaver they ordered, they get a lot of more. And I must say that I have a suspicion that in the phase where the criminal is buying the goods from the original site, in some cases I think that he either got access to a cardholder that he or she manipulated, or maybe he used a card with a static 3D code and actually used the 3D system to do the purchase, and then he just bought a lot more, and that's why you suddenly have extra goods when you order via this page. Because some banks around the world have a tendency to, as long as it's fully authenticated 3D, then they sometimes forget to fraud report it, and then it will never end at merchant's end. And in the case where you actually fraud reported, these merchants, they might have a significant turnover where they will not really see this as a very huge problem. So maybe the response time before they realize that fraud is going on will be a little bit longer. And then in one of the cases, actually also, some of these criminals, when they are not able to deliver the goods from their web shop, then they actually refund the genuine customer from their online shop, and that is kind of to keep their e-commerce shop or their online marketplace very clean, so they don't get in problems or in troubles with the online market, because somebody will start doing disputes on the online market. So that's kind of a way that they try to keep their track clean. Then one of the things that I also think is very interesting is both cashing out, but also the money laundering that potentially is going on in the online gaming industry. And this is kind of special. This is we're living in a world where there's new currencies, so it's not only dollars and euros anymore. It's also likes and followers and skins in online gaming that has suddenly become their own currency. And sometimes that's a little bit difficult to understand, at least for me. And therefore, a nice way of doing money laundering or cashing out with stolen cards is actually just to buy and build profiles in online gaming and then selling them to other people. And I think I would call that a very interesting way of doing it. One of the things that is also possible in some of the online online games is actually you can gamble, or at least in my perception, it's gambling. So you could go to a casino and play on a casino in the online game as your virtual profile goes to a casino and put money on red or black. And one of the challenges with that is that a lot of authorities, they don't really define that as really gambling. So sometimes that could also be a way of avoiding local laws on gambling, like some of the laws that we have here in the Nordics on that you need to be very certified to do or to offer gambling for people. So in that sense, I would also call that kind of interesting, and also an interesting way to cash out for criminals. Again, you could both launder money with this one, but you could also cash out on with stolen cards. At the moment, I am not able to see the slides, but I hope that we are still on the right page. I want to move forward to the bust-out merchants. This is also some of the things that we have seen in the past. So here in the Nordics, we've seen a couple of examples of merchants where suddenly a new kind of website pops up that is a complete copy of a very well-known merchant, and then via ads on social media, people are led to this shop. They see a very nice offer. They don't realize that the URL on this web page is not completely the same as normal. Then they go in, order some goods, and even in these cases, you could receive a text message with your 3D code in, saying that you're just about to buy for this amount on this merchant, and the consumer here would approve that because that's what they believe they are. But what they don't know is that somewhere around the world, a criminal have made a kind of a fake merchant, a fake version of that merchant, maybe with kind of forged documents. They got onboarded in the payment world and were able to take these card transactions. And then before anybody realizing that there is no goods, nobody received the goods, then the merchant is gone. The merchant is closed, the money is gone, and everybody loses money and kind of trust in the digital world when this happens. One of the things we are also seeing here is merchants that do a little bit of the same, but with counterfeit goods. So you actually receive something, but it was not totally what you expected you got out of it. Then I want to move on to, and again, I'm not completely sure that I'm on the right page. So moving into real-time phishing. It could also be smishing. There's a lot of shings. I think that to make it simple, I would just call it phishing via text messages. So what happens here is that the fraudster picks up the details from you responding to the phishing mail. So the fraudster is actually sitting in real time when you get the mail. Could be something like that there is a package on its way to you. We saw that before Christmas here in the Nordics. Everybody was expecting their Christmas gifts via postal packages. So not unusual to get that text message or that mail. So when you respond to that and type in your credentials, the criminals is actually picking up the credentials in real time and entering it somewhere. Could be in your bank, could also just be your card details and abusing them somewhere in an e-commerce shop around the internet. And then when he get to the point where the criminal have ordered his goods, then he might be prompted for a two-factor authentication 3D message. Could be both when he tries to log into e-bank or when he tries to do the purchase on the internet. And then the good person here who got phished is still waiting for his or her log on and is now prompted with a message saying that please type in the code we just sent you on the phone. And even though that the text message with the 3D code includes information about what it is that is going to happen, and in the case we saw before Christmas here in the Nordics, it was a very small amount, and people, they were actually agreeing that that was what they wanted. I would call it hybrid phishing because it was not really phishing. So what happened in that case was that you were giving away your 3D code and then enrolling your card into a subscription without it really knowing that it was a subscription, but you wanted or you thought you were paying for postal expenses for a smartphone that you just won in a competition. But what happened was actually that of course the criminal were obtaining that code and were ordering goods somewhere around the world or logging into your e-bank and then cashing out that way. What actions can you as an issuer or anybody around the world that want to combat fraud actually take to prevent this fraud? The first thing is to think about collaboration and networking, and also converging in the field of detection. So there's a lot of detection going on with issuers fighting financial crimes, AML and risk and suspicious activity. And there's a lot of data that is interesting for what is going on, and then we tend to sit in silos trying to combat a little bit of the same. So I think that what we need to do now is to see that this is all financial crime, and we need to combat that somehow together instead of sitting alone. And also collaboration is not only internal with breaking down the silos, that is also abroad. So if I experience something, I shouldn't just sit with that information alone. I should kind of share that with others interested in that. And then think about the end-to-end I tried to describe that with kind of the NIST framework inspired end-to-end. That is something you need to think about when you introduce new processes, products, services. Always try to think through that end-to-end process. Third one is very, very important. That is where you need to find the right balance between your brains and your technologies, because you cannot solve a problem alone with good brains, and you cannot solve it with nice technologies. You need to have a strict balance here, and I would say that fraud experts is a kind of scarce research, and we in the fraud business are also very, very strange people. So that can be a very, very large challenge to get the right brains onboarded. And basically, everybody, at least with a budget, can buy technology. So I really encourage you to focus very much on the brains and getting the right people onboarded, people with the right mindset, and not only let this be driven out of the IT security department. Then I can promise you that you will not succeed in combating fraud. You need to have different people around the table. And also a part of that is to recognize that there is no silver bullet. There is no single solution that will solve everything. So again, you will never find a system that can do it all for you. So you really need to balance that, because if you don't balance that, then you need to buy a lot of different technologies and have a lot of different people. And then no matter how rich you are, you will eventually run out of people. So you need to be really, really clever in this area when you decide on technologies and how to combat financial crimes. Yes, I think I have said enough, and we have 8 minutes left as I see it, and I think that we are ready for some questions here. And I'll also just put the contact details on here, because if you don't like asking questions here, you're always welcome to reach out directly for me or Michaelis, always.
Good stuff. Thank you, Suna. Thank you very much for very detailed and infographic view on what's going on out there in the market. So yeah, let's get straight into the questions. We've not got a huge amount of time for that, but I think where I would start with is, and obviously we're in the Q&A session now, so anyone that's got any queries, please do use the attendees question box to get them in there. But there's several around SCA, so Suna, if you don't mind, let's start with that. The question is, how do you think the fraudster's modus operandi, will change when SCA becomes mandatory?
So I think I also touched a little bit upon it, but I think that what we should expect is that they would now go for, and this sounds really, really wrong, but they will go and identify the weakest link, and that will be us as people. We will be vulnerable to stories that is appealing to us. So I'm pretty sure we will see the fraudsters moving into kind of tricking us to hand over credentials and security codes and so on to be able to commit the fraud, and then they will test other channels. So I'm pretty sure we will also see a lot of more activity on the account-to-account fraud, even though we already see a lot.
As a quick follow-up to that, do you think that card fraud in its totality will decrease, or do you think it will maintain the same volume or increase with SCA? What do you feel on that?
Yeah, I think that kind of depends on how you define the laws, because I work with a gross loss and then a net loss, and that is after the dispute process you have a real loss that you realize as an issuer. And I think that actually I have a fear that we will see an increase in the net loss, because fraudsters will move to this social engineering, and that is where you actually lose, the opportunity to do the chargebacks as an issuer. So the gross loss might go down, but I would expect that over time we will see an increase in the net loss if we don't do anything, of course.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a look at this other one. How is the development in card present fraud in the Nordics? Shoulder surfing and followed by large ATM withdrawals.
Yeah, actually, that's the good news, because that is a decreasing trend we see at the moment, but it's not something that has kind of have been solved by itself. So we have seen significant decreases the last 2.5 years. mainly based on banks being very alert, so issuers that respond very fast to the withdrawals, and then kind of utilizing us as a hub here in the Nordics to have a collaboration with law enforcement and so on, to physically go out and try to stop these criminals. We have seen criminals been kind of transported to the Nordics just to do this kind of fraud, but our authorities have been very, very helpful and have been a large part of driving down these losses by being very proactive on the street, and also the usage of contactless is actually good. I know a lot of paranoia is going on with contactless transactions around the world, but one good thing, at least here for us here in the Nordics, is that when you do a contactless transaction, it's not possible to do shoulder surfing and get the PIN from the cardholder, and that have also helped a lot. We have around now that 75% of our transactions here in Denmark alone is contactless transactions.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Okay, thank you. So we've got one here. What do you think are the synergies fraud risk activities share with general IT risks? For example, controls against internal actors.
That's a really good question. To be honest, I'm not sure what to say really wise about that, but I think that when it comes to controls, I also described a little bit about the convergence here. So again, here we also need to converge to our IT security, also for the internal part, because there is a lot of data that we need to utilize, no matter where you try to combat fraud, whether it's internal or external. So again, I think my answer here would be convergence.
Okay, thank you. And in answer, there's a second part to the question, which is, can we get a copy of the presentation, which of course will be provided later on after we're finished. Okay, moving quickly on for a couple more. So you mentioned and talked about Mage. The question is it possible to say anything about how many merchants are affected?
That would not be a totally clear answer, but that is a lot. And I would say that if we look back for December, I have seen more than 2,500 shops that have been affected in the end of November and through December. And I think that the activity have actually not been higher than normal in that month. That is just the numbers I can think of now. I expected actually activity to increase around the Christmas shopping and also around Black Friday. But actually, we didn't see an increase. I think that maybe that's because there is no room for having increases because there is just so much going on in that space at the moment with Mage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I think that's one for us to keep an eye on and keep an update on. PCM has been following that, and you probably find more information on both the NET's website and PCM website on Mage. So, Sune, here's a nice one for you to finish with. Maybe it was mentioned, but can you please clarify the result of your fraud ensemble, please?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it. I said a lot, so I'm not sure. But when we went live, it was of course not a big bang. So we have been running in shadow production before. So when we went live, we were hoping that we were going to achieve the 25% from day one, and we did. And then over time, it increased, and we are looking at something around 40%. And that is kind of, the detection is 40% of what we didn't detect before. So that's also important maybe to notice that we were not trying to, stop more of the fraud that we actually stopped with rules. So we had an ambition to stop what we didn't stop before.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that, because actually the number I heard when you were presenting was 4%. So actually it's 40, right?
Yes, 40,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, 40. Brilliant. Well, look, thanks to everyone who took their time today to join the webinar. As we've mentioned before, this will be packaged up and sent around, so you'll be able to watch and listen again and share with colleagues. Thank you to Nets for partnering with PCM on these fraud webinars and reports, and thank you to Suna, of course, for taking his time out to present what is a very in-depth and interesting overview of what's going on in the fraud landscape. So thank you, Suna, and thank you everyone for joining.